What would you do if one day, when you had paid for your rightful place, had boarded the plane with the composure of an adult, but just because of the color of your skin, you were asked to stand up and leave the seat you had bought? What would you do? If the eyes of the people around you split in two, one half looked away awkwardly, the other half was silent out of fear. Only you were left, facing a seemingly simple but heartbreaking choice. Keep silent so that everything will be fine, or stand up to protect your own dignity, if it were you. What would you choose? Today's story begins with such adversity, a moment that anyone who has ever experienced injustice can see themselves in, a moment small enough to be overlooked, but big enough to change a system. So, what really happened on that flight? And why did the entire crew pay the price after just 5 minutes? Come join me in the story. If you feel this is a thought-provoking topic, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread meaningful things together. The cabin lights were dimmed to a warm, golden haze. It was the kind of glow that made everything look softer. Every wrinkle, every sharp expression, every tired eyelid ready for a long flight across the country. Flight 782 from New York to San Francisco was running a little late, and passengers in first class were settling into their wide leather seats, adjusting blankets, scrolling through their phones. At seat 1A, Evan Marshall placed his hands on the armrests and took a slow breath. He wasn't thinking about work or deadlines or the meeting waiting for him in California. He was thinking about the call he'd had with his mother barely an hour before boarding. She had told him, as she always did, "Just be safe, baby. People out there don't always see the truth in you." He had smiled at her worry, but he never dismissed it. Not in this country, not with the life he lived. He leaned back, feeling the gentle hum under the floor as the engines warmed. The chill in the cabin was sharp, enough to make him pull his jacket closer. On his lap was a small, worn leather notebook, one he carried on every flight. A habit from years of traveling, a grounding ritual. Everything felt normal, routine, peaceful, until a shadow suddenly eclipsed the warm light above him. A flight attendant. Young. Nervous fingers twisting the corner of her notepad, eyes darting away and then back to him, as if preparing for something she didn't want to say. "Sir," she began softly, "there's been a change in seating. I'm going to need you to move to another seat." Evan looked up, polite but puzzled. "I'm sorry. There must be a mistake. This is my assigned seat." She swallowed. "It's just that Mrs. Ridge always sits here." For a moment, the hum of the cabin faded. The quiet sank into his chest like a weight. He knew this feeling too well. A few rows down, a sharply dressed woman, mid-50s, pearl necklace, tailored coat stood waiting. Helen Ridge. Her arms were crossed, her expression a blend of entitlement and impatience. She wasn't even pretending to hide it. Evan could feel eyes turning toward him, some curious, some judgmental, some pretending not to look. He stayed still for a beat, letting the absurdity of the moment settle, letting his chest rise and fall once. Then he spoke gently, with the calmness that had carried him through years of boardrooms, negotiations, and silent battles he rarely talked about. "I'm not moving from this seat," he said, his voice steady, soft, but unmistakably firm. "This seat was assigned to me." The young attendant faltered. I understand, sir. It's just, this is the seat she always has. She's one of our most loyal flyers. She requested it, and I paid for it." Evan answered, no anger, no sharpness, just truth, delivered like a simple fact. A ripple passed through the cabin, small murmurs, the kind that rise when people sense something wrong, but aren't sure if they're allowed to comment on it. The attendant stepped aside, and a second figure approached, this one older, wearing a darker uniform, shoulders squared with authority. Laura Bennett, the first-class supervisor. Her tone carried something the first attendants didn't, a kind of rigid certainty that made the air colder. "Sir, I'm going to need you to cooperate," Laura said. "Mrs. Ridge is a Titanium Elite member. She sits in 1A every time. It's part of our service culture." Evan turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "That may be your culture," he said softly, "but my ticket still says 1A. Laura exhaled sharply, the way people do when they feel challenged by someone they didn't expect to push back. Her jaw tightened. "Let's not escalate this. Please gather your belongings." Around them, the little moments of a quiet cabin dissolved. Blankets paused in midair. Headphones stayed halfway lifted. People leaned, subtly or not so subtly, to listen. Evan felt all of it, the weight of the stairs, the swirl of assumptions, the uncomfortable tension that filled the aisle. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked to move for someone else. Not the first time someone assumed he didn't belong where he stood, or sat. But the ache inside him wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something older. Something carved deep. He lowered his eyes to his notebook, then closed it gently. A gesture as quiet as the voice he used when he finally spoke again. "I'm not leaving this seat." The words were calm, measured, but they struck the air like a dropped stone. Laura blinked, no longer professional, now irritated. Before she could speak, a male passenger several rows behind raised his phone subtly, pretending to scroll while filming. Another passenger whispered, "This is ridiculous," while Helen Ridge clucked her tongue, shaking her head as if she were observing a misbehaving child. Evan breathed in, a long, steadying breath. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't tense. He had learned long ago that calmness unsettled certain people far more than anger ever could. Laura folded her arms. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, I will have to involve the captain." Evan finally lifted his gaze back to her, and for a moment, his eyes reflected something deeper, something tired, something restrained, something that had been carved into him from decades of carrying himself with dignity in places not built for men like him. "Do what you need to do," he said. And just like that, the quiet cabin snapped. Passengers straightened, phones lifted a little higher. Helen Ridge smirked, adjusting her pearl necklace like she'd already won. Laura turned away briskly, heading toward the cockpit, and Evan sat still. Not because he wanted to fight, not because he wanted attention, but because, deep in his chest, he felt the echo of something he could not ignore, a voice he had heard before, a voice that had shaped him. If you walk away every time they push you, they'll never stop pushing. The voice of his father, gone for years now, but never gone from him. Evan ran his fingers along the worn spine of his notebook and waited. The cabin of Flight Man 82 was no longer peaceful. It was holding its breath. And so was he. When Laura Bennett disappeared toward the cockpit, silence pressed against the cabin walls like a slow, heavy tide. Evan Marshall remained seated, hands calm on his lap, but something in his eyes had changed. Not sharpness, not defiance, more like the quiet settling of a man who had been here before, in different rooms, under different circumstances, wearing different clothes, the same pattern woven through different years. He breathed out slowly, letting the tightness leave his chest. A whisper of air drifted from the overhead vent. The hum of the engine deepened. A soft cough echoed from somewhere behind him. Small sounds, but they filled the moment the way dust fills sunlight. Unavoidable. Visible even when no one wants to see them. Evan looked down at his hands. Strong hands. Steady. The kind of hands that had built his entire life from scratch. The kind that learned to type on an old second-hand laptop when he was 12. The kind that held his mother's worn grocery bags after her long shifts at the nursing home. The kind that had carried him through boardrooms full of men who looked nothing like him and never expected him to be the smartest in the room. He turned his palm upward, almost surprised by how still it was. No tremble, no anger. Only a quiet, old ache, like a scar beneath the skin. He closed his fingers again. His mind drifted back 20 years, to a different seat in a different place. At 19, he had been riding a Greyhound bus from Atlanta to Chicago for a scholarship interview. The air on that bus had smelled like dust and fast food, and every seat was covered in cracked blue vinyl. He remembered sitting near the front. He remembered a man approaching him, expression stern, saying that seat was for older folks. No one else was around, no older folks in sight. Only him, only the assumption that he did not belong. He had stood up without arguing the day. He had told himself it didn't matter, but that moment had settled somewhere deep, a quiet bruise, one he never talked about. Now, sitting in seat 1A of a high-end aircraft, that same old bruise pulsed faintly, not enough to break him, just enough to remind him of the long road he had walked. Across the aisle, a man with salt and pepper hair watched him with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. He looked away quickly when Evan's eyes met his. People never wanted to be caught looking, but they always looked. Curiosity was a heavy thing. Judgment was heavier. A gentle notification buzzed on Evan's phone. A text from his mother. "Arrived yet?" Evan typed back slowly. "Not yet. I will call you when we land." He stared at the message after sending it. He hadn't told her about what was happening. She worried enough already. She had lived long enough to know how easily dignity could be taken from people who looked like him. She carried that fear in her bones, the way mothers do. Evan slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and let his gaze drift forward again. Through the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, he could hear two attendants whispering. Their voices were low, but the tension made every sound feel amplified. One whispered, "Why is this happening?" The other replied, "They say she knows people at corporate." Evan did not turn. He simply listened. Listening was something he had learned long ago. People revealed truth in whispers far more often than in speeches. A faint shadow suddenly appeared beside him. This time, it wasn't another crew member. It was the young attendant from earlier. She looked conflicted, as if caught between empathy and fear for her job. "Sir," she said quietly, "can I get you some water while we wait?" Her voice carried a tremor of genuine concern. It softened something inside him. "Thank you," Evan replied. "Water would be nice." She nodded quickly and retreated. That tiny gesture, simple as it was, offered a thin thread of humanity in an otherwise cold moment. Evan appreciated it more than she would ever know. As he waited, he let his gaze settle on the small window beside him. The world outside was nothing but darkness, with faint lights dotting the runway. A quiet evening, cold and uneventful. No one out there could guess what was unfolding inside this cabin. He whispered to himself, barely audible even to the air around him. Not again. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a complaint. Just an acknowledgement. A weary statement of fact. He tightened the button on his jacket and straightened slightly. If there was one thing he refused to do, it was shrink. His father had once told him, while polishing an old pair of work boots, "People will try to make you smaller than you are. Don't help them." Those words guided Evan through college, through his first job as a junior data analyst, through the years of building what would become Marshall Insight Labs, one of the fastest-growing analytics companies in the United States, a company he built on fairness, transparency, accountability, the exact values being challenged before his eyes. Footsteps approached again. Firmer this time, from the cockpit. Evan did not look up immediately. He stayed still for a breath, as if giving himself a final second of peace before the storm reached him. Then he raised his head. The captain stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and spotless, cap tucked neatly under his arm. His expression was unreadable, carved in professional stone. "Sir," the captain said, "I've been informed that you're refusing to change seats." His voice carried authority sharpened by years of being obeyed without question. Evan nodded once. "I'm refusing an unfair request." The captain inhaled, slow and controlled. "Sir, you need to comply or we cannot take off." There was an unmistakable finality in his tone. A verdict, not a discussion. Evan tilted his head slightly. For a moment, he wondered if the captain saw him as a problem to be solved, or a disruption to be removed, or, less than that, something inconvenient. He felt a question rising in him, one he did not voice. Why does a seat matter more when someone like me is in it? But he didn't ask. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply replied, "I haven't done anything wrong." The captain's jaw clenched. He shifted his weight. Passengers around them held their breath. Even the air seemed to wait. Before the captain could respond, The young attendant returned with a cup of water. She stopped, seeing the tension, and whispered, "I'll leave this here," placing it gently on the tray. Evan offered her a grateful nod. The captain exhaled again, this time sharper. "Sir, if you do not leave this seat, I will have no choice but to remove you from this aircraft." Evan held his gaze, calm, rooted, then do what you have to do. The captain didn't respond with words. He motioned to Laura Bennett, who stepped forward with a rigid expression. "Let's escort him out," she said. As she reached for the armrest beside him, Evan placed his notebook into his coat pocket and stood slowly, deliberately, a single movement that carried decades of history. He did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He simply walked, every step quiet, but louder than any argument he could have made. Passengers watched him pass, some with guilt, some with discomfort, some with quiet outrage. He felt all of it, but he did not look back. At the cabin door, the cold air met his face with a sting. He stepped out. The door closed behind him with a soft but devastating click, and in that moment, standing alone in the jet bridge, he felt something old and familiar rise inside him. Not anger, something steadier. Resolve. The kind that does not shout. The kind that waits. The kind that changes everything. He inhaled deeply, looked at the quiet terminal ahead, and whispered a promise only he could hear. This isn't over. It wasn't a threat. It was truth, and it was enough. The jet bridge was quiet, colder than the cabin he had just left. Evan Marshall walked slowly toward the terminal, each step carefully measured, as if rushing might crack something fragile inside him. The overhead lights hummed faintly. Their white glare painted the floor with long shadows. His own shadow stretched ahead of him, tall and solitary, like a companion that had followed him his entire life. He reached the end of the jet bridge and paused, not because he needed rest, but because the transition from the charged atmosphere inside the plane to the stillness of the terminal felt jarring. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself, just breathing in, out, letting the tension seep from his shoulders. Somewhere behind him, footsteps echoed from the cabin. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The situation had already unfolded the way it always did when the people in charge made up their minds. He found an empty seat near the large window overlooking the runway. The glass was cool beneath his fingertips. Beyond it, the aircraft he'd been forced to leave stood like a silent monument, the cabin lights glowing faintly through the small oval windows. It looked peaceful from the outside, almost innocent. Yet inside, the air he left behind still carried a bruise he could feel deep in his chest. He sat down gently, placing his notebook on his lap. For a long moment, he didn't open it. He simply let his mind drift backward, to the morning before the flight, when his day had begun with a kind of quiet hope he couldn't easily find anymore. Early that morning, at 5:30, he had been in his kitchen brewing a pot of coffee. The kitchen smelled of fresh beans and toasted bread. Sunlight hadn't reached the windows yet. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of living alone, where objects stay exactly where you leave them, and the silence feels almost like a second presence. He had gone through the motions of his routine, the same one he kept to maintain balance in the life he had built. 2 slices of toast, a glass of water, a few minutes stretching in the living room to ease the tightness in his back. Then a call from his mother, right on schedule. She lived in a small house in South Atlanta, the same one he grew up in. He still paid the property taxes, though she insisted on covering the monthly utilities herself. Pride, she always said. Dignity mattered more than people understood. That morning, her voice had been soft but warm through the phone. "Are you packed, sweetheart?" "Yes, ma'am," he had replied, smiling. "You ask me that every time. And you never answer me with yes the first time," she teased. "So, I have to check." He remembered laughing, a small, genuine laugh that came from a place not everyone got to see. His mother had that effect on him. She grounded him, reminded him of who he was before the world demanded he become something else. She had paused then, her tone shifting the way it did when she was thinking about things she didn't want to burden him with. "You traveling alone this time?" "Yes." A longer pause. He knew what she wanted to ask, knew it before she said it. "Be careful. Evan, people still carry their own storms." He didn't argue. He never did. She had lived through more storms than he would ever fully grasp. "I'll be careful," he promised. "I always am." In the terminal now, that conversation washed over him again, soaking into the ache sitting just beneath his ribs. His mother's voice always sounded like truth wrapped in warning. He opened his notebook slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside were pages filled with ideas, sketches of data models, outlines for future projects, and handwritten notes from moments of clarity that struck him during late flights or early train rides. But there were also pieces of himself scattered through these pages, thoughts he never spoke aloud, memories that didn't fit into business meetings or polished presentations. He flipped through a few pages, stopping at one with a single sentence centered on the paper. "Dignity is not a favor." He stared at the words, remembering when he wrote them. Almost a decade ago, after he had been quietly passed over for a promotion he had earned, the company had chosen someone else, someone less experienced, someone who fit their vision better. That disappointment had fueled him to leave, start his own venture, and build Marshall Insight Labs into a company that reshaped corporate ethics and accountability. He touched the ink gently, almost like a pulse. Back then, he had sworn to himself that he would never again let someone take from him what he had earned. Seat 1A today wasn't about luxury or ego. It was about what that seat represented, a place he paid for, a place he earned, a place he had every right to occupy. Another memory surfaced, uninvited but vivid. He was 9 years old, standing outside a grocery store with his father. He remembered the heat of summer, the way it shimmered on the pavement. They had bought a small bag of apples using the few dollars they had. At the checkout counter, the cashier had spoken to his father in a tone dripping with cold suspicion, asking him twice if he had enough money to pay, even after seeing the cash in his hand. Evan had stood there, too young to understand everything, but old enough to recognize disrespect. His father had smiled through it, a tired smile, a practiced one, when they walked out. Evan had asked why the cashier talked to him like that. His father had looked down at him with kind eyes that held a heaviness no child should ever have to notice. Some people see the world through fear, and when they're afraid, they try to make others small. But being treated small doesn't mean you are. That memory, too, carved a place in Evan's bones. Now. As he sat in the terminal, watching the crew prepare the flight he was no longer allowed on, he felt the weight of those words all over again. A group of passengers walked past him, speaking in hushed voices. One of them, a young man with glasses, whispered, "That's him, the guy they kicked off." The others glanced without stopping. Evan lowered his eyes. He didn't mind being seen. What he minded was being seen for the wrong reasons. He closed the notebook gently, as if closing a chapter of a story he wasn't ready to end. The leather made a soft sound under his fingers. He held it for a moment before placing it back into his jacket pocket. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification he hadn't expected, an email from his assistant, Claire. Subject, "Call me as soon as you can. Urgent." He stared at the screen, sensing the shift in the air around him, a shift that was quiet but unmistakable, the kind that told him the story unfolding here was far from finished. The runway lights blinked in the distance. A plane lifted off the ground with a smooth, effortless rise. Evan remained seated, steady and silent. Whatever storm lay ahead, he was no stranger to weathering it. He lifted his phone, hesitating for only a breath before tapping to call Claire. The moment the call connected, she answered in a hurried whisper. "Evan, something just happened, and you're going to want to hear this." His pulse stirred, not fear, not anger, just readiness. The life he built had taught him one thing with absolute clarity. You stay calm, then you rise. Always. Inside the aircraft that Evan had just left, the energy shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Passengers who had been adjusting pillows or choosing movies were now sitting a little straighter, their senses sharpened. It was the kind of tension that slipped quietly into a room, not with noise, but with stillness, a stillness too heavy to ignore. Helen Ridge stood near the aisle, one hand resting on the back of a seat as she waited for the crew to resolve what she considered a minor inconvenience. Her posture radiated impatience, though her smile was polite and perfectly practiced. She kept glancing toward the cockpit, as if ensuring the situation was being handled quickly enough. Around her, whispers rippled through the rows like wind passing through tall grass. Some passengers spoke softly, hiding their voices behind raised hands. Others exchanged looks that said more than words could offer. Near the window on the opposite side of the cabin, a man in his 40s shut off his tablet and watched the aisle with furrowed brows. He had paid for his seat like everyone else, but seeing a fellow traveler removed so forcefully had unsettled him. A quiet question lingered in the back of his mind. If that could happen to him, could it happen to any of us? But he said nothing. Silence often felt safer. As the aircraft waited, the young attendant returned to her station, her hands trembling slightly. She had offered Evan water moments before he was escorted out. Now she stared at the empty place where he had been sitting, her expression caught between guilt and powerlessness. She pressed her lips together, lowered her eyes, and tried to steady her breathing. Laura Bennett moved briskly through the cabin, her expression fixed in tight professionalism. She checked seat assignments, spoke in low tones to a few passengers, and repeated, with forced calm, that the delay would be resolved shortly. Beneath her steady exterior, a knot formed in her chest. She had been in difficult situations before, but something about this one made her uneasy, not because she doubted her authority, but because she sensed, in the quiet reactions around her, that the atmosphere had shifted in a way she could not easily control. She turned toward Helen. "Mrs. Ridge, we will seat you shortly," she whispered in a reassuring voice. Helen offered a satisfied nod, smoothing her coat with delicate fingers. "I appreciate your help, dear. I fly this route often. I value consistency." Her tone carried a sweetness that did not quite mask the meaning beneath it. A few rows behind her, a passenger lifted his phone to send a message, but paused when he noticed another traveler quietly filming. He hesitated, then slowly slid his phone back into his pocket. It was safer to stay uninvolved. That was the unspoken rule people often followed in uncomfortable moments. Yet, even while doing nothing, he felt the weight of the moment press against his conscience. Near the curtain dividing first class from business, the young attendant approached Laura again. Her voice was low. "Do you think everything will be all right?" Laura responded quickly, not looking at her. "Focus on your tasks. We cannot appear disorganized." "Yes, ma'am," the attendant said softly, though the words felt heavy in her throat. Farther down the aisle, Captain Rogers stepped out of the cockpit once more. His presence carried a kind of gravity that made people straighten in their seats. He scanned the cabin briefly, measuring the atmosphere. He had flown through storms, mechanical issues, and unexpected medical emergencies, but this tension felt different. It did not come from turbulence in the air. It came from turbulence between people. He approached Laura, speaking quietly. "We need to finalize the seating and prepare for departure." "What is the status?" Laura inhaled slowly, glancing toward Helen's waiting figure. "I am arranging the seat now," she replied. "Everything will be settled in a moment." The captain nodded once, not fully convinced, but focused on getting the aircraft back on schedule. He had schedules to maintain, logs to complete, rules to follow. The airline valued punctuality. Dignity, he assumed, had already been handled. He returned to the front of the cabin, unaware that multiple passengers were still watching him with wary eyes. Helen finally stepped towards Seat 1A, placing her handbag neatly beneath the seat. She sank into the leather cushion with a contented sigh, adjusting the overhead light to her liking. For her, the problem had been resolved. The world was back in its correct order, but the cabin did not settle around her. It remained taut and uncertain. In the very back of first class, a woman with silver-streaked hair leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That didn't feel right." Her husband nodded but gave a quiet shushing gesture. Not out of disagreement, but out of concern for drawing attention. Near seat 3D, a younger man continued to film discreetly, his heart hammered in his chest as he pointed the camera at Helen's newly claimed seat. Something inside him refused to look away. He had grown up watching stories unfold online, injustices caught on small screens and reshaped into large conversations. He sensed this moment belonged to that world where silence turned into regret. In the galley, the young attendant set a stack of cups onto a counter with shaking hands. She felt a tightness building in her throat, a heaviness sitting behind her ribs. She had been trained to remain neutral, to serve with a smile, to avoid confrontation. But she could not erase the image of Evan's steady eyes when he said he had done nothing wrong. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "This isn't how it should be." The aircraft door remained open as ground crew moved in and out, finalizing checks. Through the open doorway, cool air drifted into the cabin, carrying a scent of jet fuel and winter wind. The contrast between that sharp air and the stale tension inside made the space feel even smaller. Passengers shifted in their seats. People who had never exchanged glances before were now quietly reading each other's faces, trying to understand their own reactions. Some felt uneasy. Some felt ashamed. Some felt complicit. Others simply wanted the flight to move on. But the air did not move on. It thickened. It sank deeper. It waited. Helen, oblivious to the discomfort around her, opened a magazine and flipped through the pages with contentment. For her, the narrative was simple. She had been given what she had always received: consistency. Outside, on the terminal side of the window, Evan remained seated at his gate, unaware that inside the cabin, the story was still shifting one silent inch at a time. Back inside the aircraft, Captain Rogers signaled for the door to be prepared for closure. The young attendant hurried to her position, stealing one last glance at the empty place where Evan had been sitting. Something inside her whispered a warning she could not name. Laura lifted the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly." Her voice was smooth, controlled, but the heaviness in the cabin did not lift. Passengers glanced at each other again. They knew something had shifted in the air, though none of them could predict how far-reaching that shift would become. For now, they could only feel it. A small discomfort, a quiet crack, a disruption in the story they had expected this flight to be, and though the cabin lights had returned to their soft glow, the peace had not returned with them. It hovered outside reach, thin as glass, waiting to shatter. The voice on the other end of the call trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. Claire Hensley was rarely shaken. She was steady, intelligent, and unflinchingly loyal, the kind of assistant who anticipated problems before they surfaced. If she sounded different now, it meant something had already shifted in a direction Evan had not yet seen. He tightened his grip on the phone, leaning forward in his seat by the window. Outside, the runway lights blinked in slow, steady intervals, as if marking the quiet seconds between breaths. "Claire," he said gently, "slow down. Tell me what's going on." There was the sound of a door closing on her side of the call. Then her voice lowered, as if she wanted to keep the words from anyone passing by. "A video," she said. "Someone recorded what happened on the plane. It's already spreading through internal channels. And the board has seen it." Evan let the words settle before responding. He didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't allow even a small twitch to show on his face. He simply breathed in slowly, letting the air fill his chest, then breathed out again. He watched the dark silhouette of the aircraft he had been removed from. From this distance, it looked peaceful, almost harmless. He knew better now. Appearances rarely held the whole truth. "How many people have seen it?" he asked. "A lot," Claire replied. "It's moving fast. Someone posted it on a private employee forum, and it jumped to the ethics division chat too. A few members of the board messaged me directly asking if you were all right." Evan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence stretch. There were years behind that silence, years of pushing forward, of swallowing slights, of choosing dignity over retaliation even when the world seemed to offer him neither. He finally spoke. "All right, send me the clip." Claire hesitated, Are you sure you want to see it now? I need to, he answered. When the message arrived, he tapped the screen. The video filled his phone. The image shook slightly as the person filming tried to look casual. It captured the aisle, the tense expressions, Laura's rigid stance, the captain's authoritative posture. It captured Helen Ridge's satisfied composure. And it captured him, seated quietly, answering in a calm voice that carried more steadiness than the moment deserved. He watched himself say, "I haven't done anything wrong." He watched the captain insist, "Leave the aircraft." He watched the moment he stood up, the passengers staring, the subtle looks, the discomfort, the feeling he knew too well. Claire's voice returned, softer. "They're saying the situation looks really bad, especially with who you are." Evan kept his eyes on the dark screen a few seconds after the video ended. He felt no need to replay it. Once was enough. He had lived it already. "Does the board want to meet?" he asked. "They scheduled an emergency call 30 minutes from now," Claire said. "And Evan," they sounded upset. "Not at you." He nodded slowly. "Good. I'll join from here." A soft exhale released from her side. "I figured you'd say that." He ended the call with a quiet thank you and lowered the phone into his lap. A heaviness lingered in his chest. Not the heaviness of humiliation. That feeling had tried to reach him, but he refused it the way a strong tree refuses a shallow wind. What he felt now was something deeper, quieter, sadness. A familiar sadness. One he had carried for so long it had become part of his bones. He looked out at the runway again, watching the faint lights flicker across the tarmac. A plane elsewhere taxied slowly toward takeoff, its engines humming with confidence. Life continued, people continued, but the moment he stood in now held a stillness that pulled at him. A seat. Just one seat. That was all it had taken to expose everything underneath. He found himself whispering, almost without meaning to. How many times does this happen when no one's recording? The question had no answer. It wasn't meant to. A memory surfaced again, uninvited but insistent. He saw himself at 27, sitting in a conference room during his second year at a tech firm. A senior manager mispronounced his name 3 times during a meeting, each time glancing at him only when absolutely necessary. Another colleague with fewer accomplishments received praise for work Evan had contributed the majority to. No recording, no video, no witnesses who wanted to speak. That moment had lingered in him like a splinter he couldn't pull out. Not painful enough to scream, just enough to remind him it was still there. Now, in a quiet airport terminal, with cold light spilling across his face from the long windows, he felt that same splinter shift. Today was not a unique wound. It was the same wound, returning in a new shape. Footsteps approached behind him. He turned slightly and saw an airport worker carrying a stack of boarding passes and equipment. The worker didn't look at him long, but he offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a simple gesture, a human one. Evan returned it. Moments later, the young attendant from the flight stepped out through the jet bridge door. She paused when she saw him, her eyes widening for a second. She hesitated, then walked toward him slowly, almost timidly. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to check that you're all right." He studied her expression. She wasn't apologizing to clear her conscience. She genuinely cared. That alone softened a tight corner inside him. "I'm all right," he said gently. "Thank you for asking." She exhaled, relief washing over her features. I didn't agree with what happened. I wasn't supposed to say anything, but I didn't think it was right. Sometimes doing the right thing is quiet," Evan replied. "You did more than you realize." Her eyes glistened slightly, and she nodded before stepping away, called back by another crew member. As she left, Evan felt a strange warmth rise through the cold ache that had been sitting in him since the moment he was removed from the aircraft. Not victory, not vindication, just a reminder that humanity still lived in small places, often quietly. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Claire. "The board wants you on the call now. Link is in your email. They are all waiting. Evan nodded to himself, rising from the seat. His legs felt steady. His breath came evenly. He picked up his notebook, folded it under his arm, and walked toward a more secluded corner of the terminal. The world outside continued moving, wheels rolling on concrete, conversations echoing faintly, people going about their evenings. But for him, everything had narrowed into a single expected moment. A moment that carried the weight of more than just a seat on a plane. As he reached a quiet spot, he opened his laptop and clicked the link. The screen lit up. Squares filled with faces appeared one by one, some concerned, some tense, some angry, but none of that surprised him. He straightened his posture, his voice steady as he greeted them. "Good evening. I understand we have something important to discuss." And as every head in the virtual room turned toward him, the air shifted again, not with fear or humiliation, but with something far stronger: recognition. What had been taken from him in that cabin was about to be examined under a much brighter light, and Evan was ready. The moment the call connected, the soft electronic chime dissolved into the low murmur of people adjusting their microphones. Evan's screen brightened with the faces of board members, each framed by their office walls or dim home study rooms. Their expressions carried a weight that revealed they had already seen the video more than once. He greeted them with a calm nod, the kind of composed acknowledgement he had practiced through years of leading difficult conversations. His voice, quiet yet steady, filled the empty corner of the terminal. "Thank you for meeting on short notice." The chairwoman, Margaret Sloan, leaned slightly forward in her window. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and the steady intelligence in her eyes had a way of anchoring any room she entered, virtual or not. "Evan," she began gently, "before anything else, we want to know how you're feeling." The question landed softly, but it reached deep. Rarely did people ask that first. Rarely did they consider the emotional toll before the logistical fallout. He appreciated it more than he allowed to show. "I'm all right," he replied, shaken but steady. A few members nodded, visibly relieved. Dr. Leon Harper, a longtime board advisor, exhaled through his nose and leaned his elbows on his desk. "The footage is troubling, deeply troubling, and the comments circulating internally are even more concerning." He paused, searching for the right tone. "Evan, you handled yourself with more composure than most people ever could." Evan lowered his eyes briefly. "Composure doesn't erase what happened." "No," Margaret replied quietly. "It doesn't." Silence settled, heavy but respectful. Another board member, Jonah Patel, cleared his throat. "The airline's actions appear discriminatory at best, reckless at worst. They removed you without cause and placed a VIP preference above protocol. Their staff never even attempted to confirm your reservation." Evan listened without interrupting. He didn't want pity. He didn't want outrage erupting on his behalf. He wanted clarity, truth, spoken plainly. Margaret folded her hands. "Evan, this is no longer just an internal concern. You are the face of our ethics division. You testify on behalf of corporate accountability nationwide. This incident undermines everything we stand for, and more importantly, it undermined you as a human being." The words carried a warmth that softened the sharp edge of the moment. He inhaled. "What are you recommending?" Before Margaret could respond, Claire suddenly appeared in a small rectangle at the corner of his screen, having joined quietly. Her usually composed face betrayed how fast she must have rushed to connect. She said softly, "The media already caught a partial version of the video. They're asking questions. They want a statement." Margaret tightened her jaw. "If this escalates, and it will, we need to be ahead of it." Jonah leaned closer. "Evan, what do you want to do?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. He could feel every detail of the terminal around him, the distant hum of luggage wheels rolling across tile, the faint announcements echoing overhead, the coolness of the window glass behind him. All of it reminded him that he was alone in a public place discussing something deeply personal, but he did not retreat from the moment. "When I watched the video," he began slowly, "I felt something familiar. Not anger, not humiliation, a deep tiredness. A tiredness that comes from knowing this isn't the first time this has happened, not to me, not to others, and my silence won't stop it from happening again. He lifted his gaze. I won't escalate anything recklessly, but I won't pretend nothing happened. Margaret's expression softened with respect. We stand behind you fully. Whatever course you choose, you will not walk it alone. Her sincerity wrapped around him like a warm cloth on a cold night. Leon added, we also have legal teams ready. If needed, Evan shook his head gently. This isn't the moment for legal battles. Not yet. Claire's voice slipped through the speakers, quiet but firm. Then what is the next step? He looked at all of them, taking in each face, each silent question. Truth, he said, not anger, not accusation, just truth. Margaret nodded. Then we'll prepare a statement that reflects exactly that. He closed his eyes for a moment. I want to address our employees first. Privately. Let them hear from me before the world does. Of course, Margaret replied. But before that, Evan continued, I want to understand what happened inside that cabin after I left. Something tells me this story didn't end when I stepped into the terminal. His intuition had been finely tuned over years of watching small details reveal large truths. And tonight, something in the air still felt unsettled. Jonah frowned. Do you think more happened? Evan thought back to the young attendant's trembling hands, her worried expression as she approached him. Her guilt felt too heavy for the simple act of following orders. Yes, he said quietly. I think more happened. Claire leaned into her microphone. I can discreetly contact the airline operations office. Someone there may be willing to speak. Do that, Evan replied. Margaret asked gently. Do you want us to continue the meeting or give you space? Stay, he said. I want us to finish this together. For the next several minutes, they discussed next steps, tone, timing, the balance between transparency and caution. He answered every question with clarity, though a piece of his mind drifted back to the last words the young attendant had spoken. This isn't how it should be. The call eventually concluded, one face disappearing after another until only Claire remained. She looked at him with concern. Evan, are you truly all right? He let the truth show in his eyes, not the polished version leaders often gave, but the quiet truth of a man carrying too many memories of moments like this. I'm managing, he said softly. Thank you for asking. Her voice warmed. You've carried a lot alone for a long time. Let us help this time. He gave a faint, tired smile. Maybe it's time I let people... They ended the call. For a moment he stayed still, the dim light of the terminal drawing long shadows across the floor. A sense of grounding returned, settling deeper than before. He placed both hands on the table. The truth had begun to unfold. And the night, heavy as it was, no longer felt suffocating. A gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. Sir. He looked up to see the same young attendant standing a few feet away. Her cheeks were flushed from cold air, and her uniform jacket was slightly wrinkled from moving quickly. She held her hands together nervously. I'm sorry to bother you again, she said softly. But something happened after you left the cabin, and I think you should know. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the kind of courage that takes time to grow. Evan turned toward her fully, his expression steady. I'm listening. As she drew a careful breath to speak, he felt the air shift once more, not with dread, with the quiet promise of truth finally breaking through the cracks. And somewhere deep inside, something long dormant stirred awake. The young attendant stood before Evan, with her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat, as if she had carried the weight of her words all the way from the aircraft to the terminal. Her hands twisted slightly, not out of fear of him, but fear of the truth she was about to release. Evan motioned gently toward the empty seat beside him. Please, sit if you'd like. She hesitated, then lowered herself slowly, smoothing her uniform skirt. Her eyes darted once toward the jet bridge, as though making sure no one had followed her. Evan kept his voice soft. Take your time. She glanced at him, grateful. My name is Lily, she whispered, giving the first piece of herself she hadn't offered earlier. He nodded in acknowledgement. Lily, all right. For a few moments she struggled with the right place to begin, gathering pieces of courage in her palms. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor, but also sincerity. Things didn't calm down after you left the plane. They escalated. He waited, steady and patient. She swallowed hard. After you stepped off, some passengers started whispering, not loudly, but you could feel the tension. People were confused. Some were angry, especially a man in the third row. He kept asking why you were removed, why no one explained anything. Evan had expected this, but not the way her voice sharpened slightly with lingering fear. He stood up. She continued. He wasn't yelling, just demanding answers. And Laura told him to sit down. She said the situation was settled and that he needed to stop interfering. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coat. But then he said something that changed the whole atmosphere. He said, I watched the man do nothing wrong. If you can treat him that way, what makes the rest of us safe? Evan's chest moved with a long breath. Not surprise, but quiet acknowledgement. He had sensed something fractured in the cabin the moment he stepped out. Silence had never been proof of agreement, only suppression. Lily continued, her voice gaining steadiness as she spoke through the memory. That's when passengers started filming more openly. Not just the first person who recorded your removal. Others, I think 5 or 6 phones were up. Maybe more. And the crew, Evan asked gently. Her eyes lowered. They didn't handle it well. Laura threatened to remove the man in row 3 if he didn't sit down. She said he was disrupting flight operations. But he was calm. Completely calm. She paused, glancing down at her hands as if ashamed of what she had witnessed. The captain came out again, she said softly. He looked frustrated, maybe overwhelmed. He told everyone to stop recording and reminded them they were on private property. But that made things worse. People argued that filming wasn't prohibited. Voices started rising. The whole cabin felt ready to snap. Evan sat still, picturing it not as chaos, but as a truth long ignored coming to the surface. Pressure always found a way through the smallest cracks. Lily drew another breath, steadier than before. And then Helen Ridge said something, loud enough for everyone to hear. Evan lifted his eyes. What did she say? Lily hesitated. She said she didn't understand why everyone was so upset, that the airline had every right to prioritize certain passengers properly. The words sat between them, like cold stones dropped into water. Lily looked pained as she continued. She said it like it was obvious, like that made everything acceptable. The memory weighed heavily on her. She shook her head. Some people gasped. The man in row 3 told her she was out of line, and she just smiled. Evan leaned back slightly, letting the window's cool glow settle against his shoulders. Lily pressed on. The captain told everyone to get seated. But before he could finish, someone from business class pulled the curtain open and shouted, asking if the man who had been removed was okay. They were talking about you. Her voice softened. Passengers who couldn't even see what happened felt something wasn't right. They wanted to know. The truth in that statement touched something deep inside him. People he had never spoken to felt his absence. Lily's tone changed, tension returning to her shoulders. And then something happened that scared everyone. Evan looked up, sensing the shift. The cabin lights flickered. The intercom failed for a moment. It wasn't connected to what happened, but people were already on edge. Panic spread fast. When the lights came back, they were brighter. Too bright. It made the whole space feel exposed. She rubbed her palms together. I tried to calm people down. I really did. But Laura snapped at me. She said I was making things worse. I couldn't pretend nothing happened. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself before continuing. The man in row 3 said he was going to file a formal complaint the moment we landed. The woman with silver hair told the captain she would too. And someone else said they recognized you, that they'd attended one of your talks on workplace dignity last year. Evan blinked slowly, absorbing the unexpected thread. You were being defended, Lily whispered. By strangers. People who didn't know your name at first. people who just saw wrong and refused to sit quiet. The emotion she carried seeped into her words. You should have heard them. They weren't shouting. They were standing up in their own way. He let the warmth of that truth settle in his chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something gentler, something that made him feel less alone in a world where dignity often required constant guarding. Lily lowered her gaze again. The situation got so bad that the captain threatened to cancel the flight if people didn't comply. He sounded angry, really angry, and he said anyone who refused to cooperate would be removed. Evan inhaled deeply. And did they? He asked. No, she said. People didn't back down. They got quieter, but not compliant. Not in the way the captain wanted. She paused, gathering the last of her courage. And that's when corporate got involved. Operations called the cockpit and demanded the plane stay grounded until the incident was fully documented. Someone from ground staff came in to tell us that supervisors from the airline's regional office were on their way. Evan frowned slightly. That piece was new, unexpected. Lily nodded. Whatever happened to you wasn't over when you left. It sparked something, a chain reaction, the kind that reaches people who weren't even there. She breathed in slowly. Those supervisors are here now, at this airport, and I heard Laura arguing with them before I came to find you. They don't sound happy, unhappy with whom Evan asked quietly. Lily met his gaze with clarity. With the crew, she said, all of them. A long silence followed. Not empty silence. Weighted silence. Predictive silence, Lily added, almost in a whisper. They know the truth now. Evan looked toward the large window again, toward the aircraft glowing faintly under the cold airport lights. What you told me, he said softly. Thank you. It takes courage to speak honestly. She exhaled, a release that seemed to lift the tension from her shoulders. I just thought you deserved to know what really happened. He nodded once, deeply. I do. As she stood to leave, he said her name gently. Lily. She turned back. You did the right thing. Her eyes glimmered with a mix of relief and gratitude before she walked away toward the terminal hallway, disappearing into the soft hum of airport noise. Evan remained seated, and he understood now that part of the storm brewing inside that plane had only just begun to reach him. He looked at his phone, the dark screen reflecting his face. Truth was no longer quiet, and tonight it had chosen its moment to speak through people who had refused to stay silent. He straightened his posture, feeling the weight shift from uncertainty to purpose. Something was moving toward him, something inevitable, and he was ready to listen. Evan remained seated long after Lily disappeared down the hallway. The echo of her footsteps faded slowly, blending with the calm murmur of the terminal. He let the silence settle around him, not to escape the moment, but to absorb it fully. His fingers rested lightly on the spine of his notebook. The airport lights above him glowed dim and steady, like distant stars refusing to flicker. He looked toward the jet bridge. The metal corridor stood open, but unmoving, as though the plane on the other side were holding its breath. Somewhere inside that narrow passage, people were confronting uncomfortable truths, truths that were no longer contained behind a closed cabin door. A shift of air behind him made him turn. 3 individuals in dark navy suits approached. Their steps were measured, not hurried, but each stride carried purpose. The woman in front was in her 50s, shoulders squared, her ID badge clipped with clean precision. Her expression held a calm severity that told Evan she was not here by accident or coincidence. The 2 men behind her carried tablets and folders tucked under their arms. They walked not like enforcers, but investigators, people accustomed to navigating problems the public rarely saw. The woman stopped in front of Evan. Mr. Marshall? She asked. He rose carefully, meeting her steady gaze. Yes. She extended a hand. I'm Dana Wilcox, Regional Director of Passenger Operations. These are Senior Compliance Officers, Richard Mays and Thomas Geller. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, practiced. It belonged to someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. May we speak with you? Dana asked. Of course, Evan replied, voice even. She gestured toward a quiet corner near the terminal windows. As they walked there together, Evan felt a calm settle over him. It was not the calm of resignation. It was the calm of a man who had spent years training himself to stand steady in the spaces where fairness was often missing. They reached the corner. Dana spoke first. "We have reviewed the initial report from the crew," she began, "and the details do not align with what we've now gathered." Evan didn't react outwardly. He simply waited. Richard tapped on his tablet. "Multiple passengers filed statements after you left the cabin. 3 submitted video clips. 2 refused to take their seats until someone from operations was called," Thomas added. "1 clip appears to show preferential treatment for a VIP customer in violation of airline policy. And potential discriminatory language was overheard." Dana's voice carried a gravity that softened slightly as she looked at Evan. "We want to apologize, directly and formally. What happened to you should not have happened to any passenger." He nodded once, taking in the sincerity. "Thank you for saying that," she continued. "We're still gathering information, but based on what we know so far, we need to speak with the entire crew. Immediately." Evan lifted his eyes toward the plane. "They're still on board." "Yes," Dana said. "We held the flight." He exhaled quietly. Not triumph, just acknowledgement that truth had reached a place where it could no longer be turned away. Dana looked at him with a mixture of professionalism and quiet empathy. "Mr. Marshall, would you be willing to clarify a few details about the interaction with the staff? Anything you remember may help." He nodded gently. "I'll do my best." They asked him about tone, sequence, whether anyone explained the situation fully. He answered calmly, recounting the events with clarity but without embellishment. He did not weaponize the truth. He simply laid it bare. When he finished, Dana glanced at her team, then back at him. "Thank you. That consistency matters." Before Evan could respond, a sudden announcement echoed faintly across the terminal. The plane's door had finally opened. The jet bridge buzzed to life. Dana turned toward the sound. "They're coming out." Evan followed her gaze. Through the jet bridge entrance, members of the crew emerged in a slow line. Captain Rogers stepped out first, face taut, his usually commanding presence softened by uncertainty. Laura Bennett walked behind him, posture rigid, lips pressed tight, her eyes scanning the terminal as if searching for an exit she could not find. Helen Ridge remained inside for now, her presence detectable only in the faint rustle of expensive fabric farther down the corridor. Lily walked with the crew but kept a small distance between herself and the others. She spotted Evan for a moment, her eyes offering a quiet nod. A feeling of respect passed between them, like a small bridge built in silence. Dana stepped forward. "Captain Rogers," she said calmly, "we need to speak privately, all of you." The captain tried to maintain control. "We have a flight to operate." Dana did not raise her voice. She simply held her ground. "Not tonight." The firmness in her tone carried authority that could not be sidestepped. Laura opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but Dana held up a hand gently. "This is not optional." The crew exchanged tense glances. A subtle panic flickered across Laura's face. The captain's jaw tightened. The young attendant looked toward the ground, bracing herself for whatever might come. Dana turned slightly toward Evan. "Would you like to step away while we speak with them?" He shook his head. "No, I'm all right standing here." She nodded, accepting his choice. Then she looked at the crew. "Before we begin, there is something you should know. Several passengers submitted recordings and written complaints. They claim the passenger removed from Seat 1A did nothing to justify removal, and that discriminatory remarks were made." Laura's breath hitched. The captain stiffened. Lily closed her eyes briefly, as if the truth finally had a place wide enough to stand in. Evan watched quietly. He wasn't here to savor the discomfort of others. He was here because he had lived long enough to understand that real accountability did not need anger to exist. It required only truth and the courage to face it. Dana's voice softened but stayed firm. "We will review these accounts in detail. But understand this now, the incident tonight is being escalated to corporate headquarters. Immediate administrative leave for all staff on this flight is under consideration until the investigation is complete. Laura finally spoke, her voice shaking. You're putting the entire crew on leave. For one misunderstanding, Dana's expression did not waver. For mishandling a situation involving a paying passenger, violating protocol, and potentially contributing to an environment of a discrimination, yes. Laura's lips parted, but the words stuck in her throat. For the first time since the ordeal began, Captain Rogers seemed to understand the magnitude. His shoulders slumped just slightly. Lily stood still, her palms pressed softly against her thighs. She wasn't relieved, she wasn't celebrating, but her eyes held a quiet steadiness, knowing that truth she had carried alone was now being carried by many. Dana motioned her team forward. Let's continue in the operations room. As they began walking away, Dana glanced back at Evan. We will update you shortly, she said softly. He nodded. The crew disappeared down the hallway, the door closing behind them with a muted thud that echoed faintly through the open terminal. The sound was not dramatic, not sharp, but it carried finality. Evan exhaled slowly, feeling a shift deep inside him. A shift that wasn't about revenge, or vindication, or proving worth. It was about seeing truth finally treated like truth. He sat back down by the window, the runway lights painting soft golden reflections on the glass. His heartbeat eased, steady as the distant hum of engines. Tonight had opened a door he hadn't asked to walk through, but now that he had, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. A sense that the world, even in its flaws, still had moments where justice could stand upright, and he sat with that feeling quietly, letting it take its rightful place inside him. The terminal quieted as the minutes passed, though the atmosphere around Evan felt unchanged, as if the air itself held the memory of what had unfolded. He remained near the window, watching reflections shimmer softly across the glass. The airport lights glowed like a chain of distant lanterns guiding airplanes through the night. He breathed slowly, steadying himself. The events of the night had begun to weave into something larger than a single confrontation. It was no longer just about a seat or a misunderstanding. It was becoming a testament to how ordinary moments could unmask deeply rooted truths. His phone buzzed softly. He glanced down. A message from Claire. The story leaked. 2 major outlets reached out. They're asking for comment. He exhaled through his nose, not surprised, but quietly reflective. News traveled faster than justice ever had. The world was eager to consume conflict, but rarely patient enough to understand what shaped it. He typed a simple reply, no statement yet, wait for my word. Before he could put the phone away, movement caught the corner of his eye. A man approached slowly from the far end of the terminal. Evan recognized him at once. It was the passenger from row 3, the one Lily had described. He walked with careful steps, as if unsure whether he should intrude. When he drew nearer, he stopped at a respectful distance. "Mr. Marshall," the man asked. Evan stood, offering a calm nod. "Yes." The man placed a hand over his chest briefly, a gesture of sincerity. "I'm Daniel Price. I was sitting 3 rows behind you." He hesitated. "I'm sorry for what happened, truly." Evan studied him for a moment. Daniel's expression held honesty, not pity. His shoulders carried the weight of someone who had watched something he wished he could have changed. "Thank you," Evan said gently. "I appreciate you coming over." Daniel exhaled, relief loosening his posture. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk." Evan gestured toward the empty seat beside him. "We can talk." Daniel sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet tremor. "I've traveled for 20 years. I've seen delays, arguments, medical emergencies. I've never seen a situation handled the way yours was." Evan remained silent, letting the space belong to him. Daniel shook his head. It wasn't just unfair, it was disrespectful. And the worst part was watching everyone look away. "I didn't want to be one of those people." "You weren't," Evan replied, calm and sincere. Daniel swallowed. "Most of us, We didn't know who you were at first. Just a man sitting quietly in his seat. When they asked you to get up, I thought it had to be a mistake. But when you stood your ground politely, I realized something was very wrong. His hands tightened. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Evan felt the softness of compassion in the man's voice. It touched something deep inside him, a part that had grown tired of holding itself upright without rest. It wasn't your burden to carry, Evan said. Daniel looked at him. Maybe not. But staying silent felt wrong. And if I've learned anything in my life, it's that silence has a way of turning into regret. Evan nodded slowly. It does. They shared a quiet moment, each reflecting on truths larger than themselves. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. I want you to know, I submitted everything I saw. I told them exactly what happened. No filters. And my wife insisted I come here and tell you that you deserve better than what you got. Evan smiled faintly. Tell her thank you. Daniel stood, placing a gentle hand on Evan's shoulder. You're not alone in this. Mr. Marshall, a lot of us saw you, really saw you. Evan felt the sincerity in the touch. When Daniel walked away, Evan watched him go with a mixture of gratitude and quiet ache. For every moment of injustice in his life, there had been people like Daniel willing to speak, willing to show up, perhaps scattered fewer than he wished, but present nonetheless. He sat back down. The night around him felt different, not lighter, but wider, as if more people had stepped into the circle of truth. The jet bridge door opened again. This time, a small group of passengers from the flight stepped out. A woman with silver-streaked hair, her husband, and a young mother carrying a toddler. They looked around the terminal until they spotted him. Then, almost unconsciously, they began walking toward him. The woman approached first. Her voice carried both grace and conviction. Mr. Marshall, we just wanted to say something. Evan rose again, steady and open. We saw everything, she said, and it wasn't right. You handled it with more dignity than most people could. Her husband nodded. We filed a report. We made sure to mention exactly how you behaved. Calm, respectful, patient. You deserve to know that. Evan's heart tightened slightly, not with pain, but with something warm, quiet, and human. Thank you, he said softly. The young mother shifted her child in her arms. My son saw what happened, and it scared him. But I want him to remember the way you reacted, not the wrong that was done, the way you stood without raising your voice. That's what I'll teach him. Emotion pulsed gently through Evan's chest. He bowed his head slightly. Your kindness means more than you know. They exchanged a few more words before the passengers drifted away, each carrying their own piece of the truth. The terminal quieted again, but only for a moment. A new sound approached the firm click of heels on polished tile. A woman in a tailored coat stepped into view, pausing several feet away. Her posture was elegant, but there was something unsettled in her breathing. The soft overhead light touched her face, revealing hesitation mixed with discomfort. It was Helen Ridge. She did not move closer. Instead, she stood still, as though testing the air between them. Evan faced her calmly. Helen's voice, when it came, trembled with something unfamiliar uncertainty. Mr. Marshall, I owe you an apology. The words lingered in the air, thin and unbalanced. Evan did not respond yet. He waited, giving her space to find the truth buried beneath her practiced poise. Helen clasped her hands in front of her. When I boarded the plane, I didn't think about anyone else. I was cold. I'd had a long day. I expected things to go the way they always do. Her breath shook slightly, but something inside me changed when I saw the crew being taken away just now. And when I watched the passengers speak out, she swallowed hard. I realized the world I've lived in has shaped my reactions more than my morals ever should have. Silence filled the space between them. Helen's eyes glistened faintly. I'm sorry for the part I played in what happened to you. Her voice broke a little. I didn't see you as a person in that moment, and you deserved better. Evan regarded her quietly, not with bitterness, not with forgiveness offered too quickly, just with honest reflection. He finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Thank you for saying that, truly. But understand, apology is not the end. It's a beginning." Helen nodded slowly, her expression vulnerable. "I understand." She stepped back, as though giving the moment the reverence it deserved. "I hope you can someday see the person I'm trying to become," she whispered. Evan held her gaze. "That choice is yours to fulfill." Helen blinked, the briefest acknowledgement, then turned and walked away down the terminal, her footsteps fading into the quiet. Evan watched her go, not with triumph, not with resentment, but with a quiet, grounded clarity. Tonight was no longer just about what he had lost. It was becoming a night defined by what others found: truth, accountability, and the quiet courage that rose in everyday people when dignity was placed in front of them. He sat once more, letting the night deepen around him. Something was shifting, something necessary, and he could feel it moving through the terminal like a soft wind, the beginning of a reckoning. And he braced himself gently for whatever would come next. The terminal grew quieter as the hour deepened, settling into a soft hum that only large empty spaces seemed able to carry. Evan remained by the window, the reflection of the runway lights shimmering against the glass like echoes of something unresolved. He felt the weight of the evening, but not in a way that bowed him. More like a cloak settled over his shoulders, anchoring him rather than burdening him. He placed his notebook on his lap and rubbed his palms together slowly, grounding himself in the simple motion. He was waiting, but he didn't yet know for what. Something in the air told him the night had more to reveal. A soft vibration broke the stillness. His phone lit up with a call from Claire. He answered gently. "Claire?" Her voice carried both urgency and cautious calm. "Evan, corporate is already awake. The CEO called an emergency meeting. The situation escalated far beyond what anyone expected." He absorbed this without flinching. "I suspected it would." "That's not all," she continued. "Passengers from the flight have already uploaded statements. Someone shared a compilation of clips from inside the cabin. They're calling it the Seat 1A incident. It's gathering traction online." Evan let his head rest lightly against the back of the chair, not out of fatigue, but contemplation. "People are speaking. They are," she confirmed. "And the narrative isn't about outrage. It's about dignity. It's about the way you carried yourself." He closed his eyes for a moment, humbled by the sincerity threading through her words. Sometimes dignity was loud. Tonight, his had been quiet, and yet it traveled. "We'll respond when the time is right," he said softly. Claire hesitated before adding, "The airline's legal department reached out to us directly. They want to talk. Soon." He felt a shift inside him, steady and undeniable. Good. They should. They ended the call with quiet understanding. Moments later, the door near the operations hallway opened. Dana Wilcox stepped out, her expression composed but tinged with the kind of weariness born from confronting a difficult truth head-on. Behind her came Richard Mays and Thomas Geller, their tablets tucked under their arms. She approached Evan with measured steps. "Mr. Marshall, thank you for waiting." He rose, attentive. "Of course." Her voice softened, though her tone remained decisive. "We conducted preliminary interviews with the entire crew. We've also reviewed the video evidence and the passenger statements." And Evan asked. Dana drew in a slow breath. This was not a misunderstanding. It was mishandling, severe mishandling. The protocols were not followed at any stage, and the decision to remove you was made without proper justification. She paused, the weight of responsibility sharpening her posture. "Effective immediately. Captain Rogers, Laura Bennett, and several crew members have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Evan nodded slowly. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just steady. Dana continued. "We will also be holding a full review of first-class operations across the region. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom." The honesty in her voice carried a quiet resonance that reached him deeply. "We owe you more than an apology," she said. Evan held her gaze. "I'm not looking for punishment. I'm looking for truth and change. The faintest genuine smile touched her lips. Then we are aligned? Thomas stepped forward. There is something else. Mrs. Ridge has formally withdrawn her VIP status for the time being. She filed a statement acknowledging she contributed to the escalation. Evan blinked, surprised by the sudden wave of accountability rippling outward. She said your words to her, stayed with her. Richard added quietly. Evan didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to feel: compassion, perhaps, or simply the awareness that people were capable of more than the worst moment they'd shown. Dana straightened. There is one final matter. The airline CEO wants to speak with you directly. Tonight, if you're willing. Evan lifted his chin slightly. We'll arrange a secure conference room, she said. It won't take long, but she insisted on addressing this immediately. Evan appreciated the urgency, though he did not let it rush his heartbeat. I'll join the call, he replied. Dana nodded, then stepped away to coordinate. Richard and Thomas followed her, leaving Evan momentarily alone again. He sank back into the chair, letting the new reality take shape in his mind. The world around him seemed to inhale and exhale with him, slow, steady, expectant. The runway lights blinked like distant signals of possibility. As he breathed, footsteps approached again. He turned to see Lily walking toward him, this time without hesitation. Her uniform jacket hung loosely from her shoulders, and she looked almost lighter than before, as though her truth had been released and now moved freely around her. Mr. Marshall, she said softly. He offered a warm nod. Lily? She clasped her hands behind her back. Dana told me you'd be speaking with the CEO soon. Yes. Her expression tightened with worry. I hope they truly hear you. Not just listen, but hear. Evan studied her carefully. Her courage was not bold or theatrical. It was quiet, almost fragile-looking, but powerful in how it refused to stand down. He said gently, You were the first person tonight who did the right thing. Don't underestimate the impact of that. Color rose in her cheeks. I didn't do anything brave. You told the truth, he replied. And sometimes that's braver than anything else. Her eyes glimmered. Thank you. She took a small step closer. Before I go, I just want you to know I'm filing my own statement. And I won't let them pressure me into changing my words. Evan's voice carried deep sincerity. I'm proud of you. A soft breath of gratitude escaped her before she turned and walked back toward the operations hallway, steadier than when she first arrived. He watched her go, feeling something shift again inside him. Tonight wasn't about a single wrong. It was about all the small rights, the whispers of integrity, the quiet acts of courage that emerged in the wake of it. A call tone chimed through his phone. A message appeared from Dana. The room is ready. The CEO is waiting. Evan rose, notebook in hand. His stride was steady, not hurried. He walked through the quiet terminal, the muted glow of overhead lights following him like a slow-moving river. As he approached the glass-walled conference room, he paused briefly outside the door. The reflection staring back at him wasn't a man defeated by injustice. It was a man shaped by it, strengthened by it, refusing to bow before it. He entered the room and sat in front of the screen where the CEO's face would soon appear. He placed his notebook beside him, leaned back, and breathed deeply. Tonight, the airline would face itself, not in fragments, not in excuses, but in the full truth of what had taken place. And Evan, steady, calm, unbroken, was ready to speak that truth, not loudly, not with anger, but with a depth that could not be ignored. The screen flickered. His moment had arrived. The screen shimmered to life with a faint blue glow as Evan sat upright, the quiet hum of the conference room settling around him. A moment later, the face of Marion Hale, CEO of Continental Skies, appeared. Her expression held a mixture of solemnity and attentiveness, the kind reserved for matters that could shape the soul of a company. Mr. Marshall, she began, her voice steady but not distant. Thank you for meeting with me at this hour. Evan inclined his head respectfully. Ms. Hale, she took a breath, choosing her words carefully. I've been briefed. I've seen the preliminary reports, and I've viewed all available footage. Before I say anything else, I want you to know what you experienced tonight was unacceptable. It does not align with who we claim to be. Evan listened quietly, his face calm yet unreadable. He wasn't here for polished statements. He wanted sincerity. Marion continued, leaning slightly closer to her camera. I want to understand what happened from your perspective. Not the reports, not the recordings. You? Evan absorbed the question for a moment, letting his thoughts settle. Then he spoke with the deliberate clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing integrity over impulse. I boarded the plane like any other passenger. I took my assigned seat. I didn't anticipate conflict. I had no desire for it. But when the request came for me to relinquish my seat without reason, without policy, without dignity, I felt something familiar. He paused, not for effect, but for truth. It wasn't about where I sat. It was about why they believed they could move me. Marion exhaled, the weight of his words grounding the room. Evan continued, his tone gentle but unwavering. I did not raise my voice. I did not disrespect anyone. Yet the escalation happened fast, too fast, and the speed of that escalation tells a story much older than tonight. He placed his hands together, fingers interlacing. I've lived long enough to recognize when the respect offered is conditional, and that's what I felt in that cabin. Condition, not equality. Silence settled across the room in a slow, steady wave. Marion lowered her gaze, absorbing the impact. I hear you, and I won't dispute a single thing you've said. She lifted her eyes again, sincerity anchoring them. You deserved better. But more than that, every passenger deserves better. Evan nodded slowly. Marion continued. The actions taken tonight by my crew, by my captain, by the supervisor, they showed poor judgment. They showed complacency, and more troublingly, bias. Her voice tightened slightly. This isn't the first time I've worried about culture slipping through the cracks. Tonight confirms we need deep change. Evan leaned back, thoughtful. Accountability is important, but transformation requires more than reaction. It requires introspection. That's why we're speaking, she replied softly. He studied her carefully. What do you plan to do? She did not hesitate. Every staff member on that flight will be relieved of duty pending full review. Mandatory retraining will begin company-wide within 72 hours. External advisors will be brought in. And I want you involved. Evan blinked. Involved? Yes, she said. Not as a figurehead, not as a token, but as a partner in shaping the standards we clearly failed to uphold. He considered this, his gaze drifting briefly to the glass wall behind the screen, where the quiet airport stretched like a living backdrop. He thought of Lily's trembling voice, of Daniel's sincerity, of Helen's fragile apology, of the passengers who stepped forward with courage that rippled outward. Why me? Evan asked quietly. Marion folded her hands. Because you showed tonight what leadership looks like under pressure, and because you understand the human cost of bias better than anyone I've ever seen, your perspective could reshape us. Evan absorbed her words. They were earnest, but he also knew that change could not be built on a single night or a single voice. I'll help, he said after a quiet moment, but only if what we do is real, not symbolic, not temporary. Marion gave an unwavering nod. Real is the only option. Evan's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained grounded. Then we have somewhere to begin. She seemed to exhale with relief, but then her face grew serious again. There is one more thing. Evan waited. Some of the passengers are contacting the press, she said. They're praising the way you conducted yourself. They're condemning what happened, and the story is growing. We cannot control its path, but we can choose how we respond. He understood. You want a public statement? Yes, from us, and perhaps from you. When you're ready. Evan looked down at his notebook, running his thumb along the smooth edge. I will not use my voice to inflame the situation, but I will use it to tell the truth. And that's exactly what we need, Marion said. They spoke for several more minutes, aligning on next steps, ensuring clarity on what reform required, not just in policies, but in culture, in empathy, in the expectation of dignity. When the call ended, the screen dimmed into darkness. Evan remained seated for a moment, letting the quiet settle over him like a warm, steadying rain. He felt something shift again inside him. Not anger, not vindication, a sense of purpose. A deeper calling rising from the rubble of a single moment of injustice. He picked up his notebook and stood. As he walked out of the conference room, he noticed Dana waiting several feet away, hands clasped in a respectful posture. Behind her, Richard and Thomas stood with quiet attentiveness. "How did it go?" Dana asked gently. Evan offered a small, thoughtful smile. "Productively. There is work ahead." Her shoulders eased, the relief visible. "We're ready to support whatever comes next." He nodded, appreciating the loyalty forming in unexpected places. Outside the wide windows of the terminal, a new plane touched down, its lights shimmering across the tarmac. The hum of engines filled the air for a brief moment before fading. The night was deep, but not heavy. It held possibility. Evan turned toward the main concourse, ready to head home. As he walked, he passed the seats where earlier emotions had swirled like unsteady currents. Now they felt calmer, steadier, grounded in new truths. He thought of the passengers who had spoken up, the employees who had come forward, the small acts of courage that, when woven together, became a force stronger than silence. Tonight had revealed something profound, not just about an airline, not just about bias, but about how ordinary people, when given the moment, could step into extraordinary clarity. And he carried that with him as he moved through the quiet terminal, the echo of his footsteps matching the steady rhythm of his resolve. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the part where meaning began to unfold. When Evan stepped outside the airport terminal, the night had begun softening toward dawn. A pale line of gold hovered at the edge of the horizon, barely visible yet certain in its arrival. The air was cool, almost cleansing, brushing gently across his face like a reminder that time continued moving even when the world felt shaken. He walked toward the parking structure with unhurried steps, his notebook tucked under one arm. The silence around him was different now. Earlier in the night, it had felt tense and heavy. Now it felt spacious, open, like a field that had been cleared for something new. His car waited on the third level, dew beating along the windshield. Before unlocking it, he paused and leaned against the driver's door, letting the quiet of the early morning settle around him. It had been hours since he first boarded the plane, yet the events still pulsed shapefully in his memory. Not painfully, not bitterly, but with a resonance that told him the story was far from its conclusion. His phone buzzed softly, a message from Claire. "Press is intensifying. Call me when you're ready." He typed a simple reply. In a few hours? He needed space before he spoke to the world, space to breathe, to understand the shift taking place inside him, and to honor the courage he'd seen that night. He unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, he didn't start the engine. Instead, he closed his eyes and let himself sit in the stillness. He thought of Lily's trembling voice, Daniel's sincerity, the passengers who approached him with unguarded truth, and even Helen, standing quietly in front of him with an apology she hadn't known how to form until that moment. The night had changed more lives than just his own. Finally, he turned the key. The engine hummed to life, its steady vibration giving him something to anchor to as he pulled out of the garage. The roads were nearly empty. Streetlights stretched across the dark pavement like long, quiet reflections. As he drove, his thoughts moved slowly, deliberately, giving shape to everything he had witnessed. It wasn't until he reached the long stretch of highway leading toward the city that his phone lit up again. This time, it was a call. He glanced briefly at the screen. It was his mother. He turned on the hands-free option. "Morning, Mom." Her voice arrived warm and familiar, carrying the grounded strength he had always admired. "Baby, I saw the clips. What happened on that flight?" He inhaled deeply, steadying his voice. It was a long night. Her tone softened, though it never lost its firmness. "Are you all right, I am," he said gently. She paused. He could almost picture her sitting at the small kitchen table in the house he grew up in, one hand resting around her mug, the other tapping lightly as she listened. "You handled yourself with grace," she said. "I'm proud of you." Evan blinked slowly, letting the warmth of her words settle through him. "Thank you. But don't carry this alone," she added. "People will want pieces of you now, pieces of your story. Make sure you keep something for yourself." He smiled faintly. "I will." They spoke for a few more minutes, her voice grounding him with every sentence. When the call ended, he felt centered in a way only family could provide. By the time he reached home, the sky had softened into a warm gray. He parked in the driveway and stepped out, stretching his back. His house stood quiet, a sanctuary of calm after the turbulence of the night. Inside, he placed his keys on the small entry table and walked into the living room. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he let the soft morning glow seep through the windows, filling the space with a gentle, muted brightness. He set the notebook on the coffee table and sank into the couch, leaning his head back. A long breath escaped his chest, one filled with everything he had held inside through the night. After several minutes, he rose and walked to the kitchen. He brewed a cup of coffee, the rich aroma rising into the air. When he lifted the mug to his lips, the warmth tasted like a reminder that the world hadn't lost its simple comforts, even after a night that had tested the boundaries of fairness. He returned to the couch and opened his notebook. A blank page stared back at him. He pressed the tip of his pen onto the paper and waited, letting the words find him instead of forcing them. Slowly, he began writing. He wrote about the way Laura's voice had sounded when she spoke to him, about the shift in Captain Rogers' posture when he decided to remove him, about the quiet strength in Lily's eyes when she came forward, about the passengers who stood beside him without being asked. But he also wrote about himself, about the familiar ache of bias that had shadowed him through childhood, through college, through boardrooms. He wrote about the calm that rose from knowing who he was in a room that tried to shrink him. He wrote until the sun began lifting itself above the rooftops, casting a warm amber light across the room. A soft knock at the door startled him gently. He placed the notebook down and walked to the entryway. When he opened the door, he found Daniel Price standing on his porch, holding 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard tray. His eyes carried the soft fatigue of someone who had slept very little, yet his posture held a quiet purpose. "I wasn't sure if this was too early," Daniel said. Evan blinked in surprise. "How did you find my address?" Daniel lifted his phone. "The airline shared your contact information with me. I asked them if I could reach out." "I hope that's all right." Evan stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel entered with careful steps. The house's calmness seemed to settle over him as he looked around. "I wanted to talk to you," Daniel said, offering one of the coffee cups. "I didn't say everything last night." Evan accepted the cup, curiosity threading through him. "What's on your mind?" Daniel sat on the edge of the armchair, his hands wrapping around his own cup. "I used to work in aviation. Years ago. I left because I couldn't stand the hierarchy anymore. The favoritism. The way some people were treated like they mattered more." Evan listened without interruption. Daniel continued, voice quiet but steady. "Watching what happened to you, it brought back things I hadn't realized I still carried. But it also showed me something hopeful. Because you didn't respond with rage. You responded with dignity." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "And seeing you handle it that way made me think maybe change is still possible." Evan placed his coffee on the table, moved by the unexpected honesty. "Daniel," he said gently, "change is always possible." Daniel exhaled, shoulders softening. "I didn't want the night to pass without telling you that." They sat quietly for a moment, the morning light filling the room around them. Finally, Daniel stood. "If you ever need anything at all, you can call me." Evan nodded with genuine gratitude. "Thank you." After Daniel left, Evan closed the door slowly, letting the silence settle once more. He returned to the living room, picked up his notebook again, and wrote the final line of the page. This night was never meant to break me. It was meant to reveal what must change. When he closed the notebook, he felt a clarity that hadn't been present before. A clarity that would shape not only the hours to come, but the days, weeks, and months ahead. The morning no longer felt like an aftermath. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something necessary, and Evan was ready to step into it. The sun rose higher as the morning unfolded, washing the neighborhood in a soft amber glow that crept across lawns and rooftops. Evan stood near the living room window, the notebook still open on the coffee table. Though he was no longer writing, he was listening. From somewhere in the distance came the faint hum of engines, not one, but many. The sound grew, steady and purposeful, like a tide gathering beyond the shore. He moved closer to the window. At first, he saw nothing unusual: a jogger passing by, a delivery truck slowing near a house 2 doors down. But then, turning the corner, a line of vans appeared: white, black, blue, each bearing the unmistakable markings of news networks. Claire had warned him the press was intensifying, but he hadn't expected them to arrive so soon. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself the way he always did when facing a challenge he hadn't invited, but would meet regardless. He stepped back from the window, letting the curtain fall gently into place. His phone rang again. "Claire?" He answered. "I see them." Her voice carried the tension of someone navigating 3 crises at once. "They've been camping online since dawn. When footage spread overnight, your name started trending. People want to hear directly from you." Evan walked to the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "Not yet." Claire exhaled sharply, though without impatience. "I know. I just want you to be prepared. They're outside because they believe something important happened last night." "It did," he said quietly. "And they look to you," she continued, "because of how you responded to it." Evan closed his eyes, breathing in the stillness. He knew this moment would come. He had been in public arenas before: awards, keynote speeches, philanthropic events. But this was different. This was not celebration. This was scrutiny of a wound still open. He returned to the living room. "I'll give a statement, but not now. Not like this." Then how Claire asked gently, "When I've spoken to the people who stood with me last night, their voices matter too." She paused, perhaps surprised, then said, "I'll help coordinate that." "Thank you." After the call ended, Evan stood in the quiet room, considering the world's sudden gaze. He felt neither fear nor pride, only a sense of responsibility, not to fame, not to narrative, but to truth. Another knock echoed through the house, soft, careful, as if the visitor feared adding pressure to an already tense morning. Evan approached the door and opened it. Lily stood on the porch. She looked smaller in the daylight, her uniform jacket replaced by a light sweater, her hair pulled back neatly. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles pale from the pressure she unconsciously applied. "Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped aside. "Come in." She entered hesitantly, her eyes scanning the living room, as though uncertain whether she deserved to stand in this space. Evan gestured for her to sit, and she lowered herself onto the edge of the couch. "I didn't mean to intrude," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but Dana told me you live nearby. I thought I needed to say something in person." Evan sat across from her, his posture patient, inviting. Lily clasped her hands tighter. "I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying everything in my head. What I said, what I didn't say. And I kept thinking, what if I had spoken earlier? What if I had stepped forward before it escalated?" Her voice cracked. She quickly wiped at her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for not being braver sooner." Evan leaned forward, his tone gentle and anchored. "Lily, listen to me. You did speak, and when you did, it mattered. Tremendously." She shook her head. "I should have done more." "You did enough," he said softly. "You told the truth when the room was heavy with silence. That takes courage. Courage rarely arrives early, but it arrives exactly when it's needed." Her shoulders trembled at his words, as though relief and guilt battled inside her. I thought you would be angry with me, she admitted, or disappointed. He offered her a faint, warm smile. I could never be disappointed in honesty. She covered her face briefly with her hands, exhaling shakily. Thank you for saying that, for being the kind of person who makes the rest of us want to be better. Evan let her emotion fill the room without rushing to ease it. Sometimes the body needed to empty itself before strength could return. When she finally lowered her hands, her eyes were clearer. I'll testify to everything, she said firmly, no matter the consequences. You won't face them alone, he replied. She nodded, absorbing the quiet promise. A sudden noise outside made both of them turn. Voices, footsteps, and the unmistakable hum of recording equipment filled the street. Someone called Evan's name faintly through the window. Lily's eyes widened. They're here for you. Yes, he said calmly, but I won't rush out there. I decide when my story is told. Lily took a slow breath, steadying herself. If you need a witness beside you when you speak to them, I'll be there. Evan felt something shift at her offer. Not gratitude alone, respect. Thank you, he said. When the time comes, I may ask. She nodded again, more confident now, then stood. Her voice was quiet but sure. Whatever happens next, I'm not afraid to stand in the open anymore. Evan walked her to the door. Before she left, she turned back. Last night, you showed everyone who you are. Today, I hope they see it too. He watched her walk to her car, the reporters unaware of her significance as they focused their attention entirely on his home. When the door closed behind him, the house felt different, filled with echoes of bravery from someone who had seemed so fragile just hours before. He returned to the living room, picked up his notebook again, and ran his fingers over the fresh ink from earlier entries. The pages no longer felt like a private record. They felt like the beginnings of a larger truth taking shape. His phone vibrated once more. A message from Dana. The internal review team wants to meet in person today. They want your perspective. He typed, "Let's schedule it." Another message from Claire arrived only seconds later. 2 senators tweeted in support of you. This is becoming national. He typed, "Understood." Then another message from an unknown number. Thank you for listening last night. Thank you for not turning away. Helen Ridge. Evan stared at the message for a long moment, not confused, not unsettled, simply aware of the strange, unpredictable ways people changed when faced with their own reflection. He did not reply. Not yet. Instead, he placed the phone down, stood, and walked toward the hallway mirror near the stairs. He looked at his own reflection, not searching for reassurance, not questioning what others saw. He looked because today, the world would demand a version of him, and he needed to know that the version he offered came from truth, not reaction. He spoke softly to the quiet house. This isn't about a seat. It's about dignity. The reflection stared back, steady and unshaken. And dignity deserves a voice. He turned away then, moving toward the kitchen. The day ahead would be heavy. Meetings, statements, decisions. The kind that shaped more than headlines. The kind that shaped culture. As he poured water into the kettle, the voices outside grew louder, filling the street with the restless energy of a nation looking toward his front door. Evan breathed in the calm of his home. The world could wait. He would speak soon, but first, he would gather himself. And then, he would walk outside with the same strength that carried him through the night. The sunlight climbed higher as the clock moved past mid-morning, warming the walls of Evan's home and casting long shapes across the hardwood floor. The soft hum of reporters outside had grown into a restless chorus. They weren't shouting yet, but their presence pressed like a steady pulse against the quiet of the house. Evan placed a hand on the kitchen counter, steadying himself as he poured hot water into a mug. The gentle swirl of steam rose in slow coils. He watched it for a moment, letting the motion calm him. Today was not a day for haste, not a day for reaction. It was a day that required intention. He lifted the mug to his lips, the warmth settling into him. The flavor was familiar, grounding, as if reminding him that even when chaos gathered outside, peace could still be chosen within. His phone buzzed again. "Claire," he answered. "Yes." Her voice came through with composed urgency. "The airline's internal team is assembling now. They have a conference room ready for the in-person meeting you agreed to." Evan nodded, though she couldn't see it. "When do they want me there?" "In about 2 hours," she said. "They want your full account. They're bringing in additional advisors, legal, training specialists, communications. It's going to be a larger room than they originally planned." Evan rubbed his thumb along the ridge of the mug. "All right." Claire hesitated. "There's something else?" Evan waited. "The CEO, Marion Hale, asked if you'd consider joining the press briefing this evening. She said she'll take responsibility publicly, but she wants the world to hear your voice too." Evan let the words settle. The world, his story, his voice. None of this had begun with intention, and yet now he stood on the edge of something larger than himself. "I'll decide after the meeting," he said. "I trust your judgment," Claire replied. "And Evan, the public isn't just watching, they're listening. You have their attention." He exhaled slowly. "Then I'll speak with care." When the call ended, the house returned to silence. But the silence felt different than before. It held not only his thoughts, but the weight of a nation waiting to understand what dignity looked like when confronted with injustice. He walked to the living room, notebook in hand, and read over his earlier writing. His handwriting was steady, every line carrying a memory, every sentence a truth reclaimed. He touched the page gently, as if acknowledging that the story he had written privately was about to become something very public. A soft knock echoed through the house. He closed the notebook and moved to the door, expecting another neighbor or possibly another witness from last night. But when he opened it, he saw Helen Ridge standing on his porch. Her posture was composed, but her face carried the quiet vulnerability of someone who had spent the night examining the parts of herself she usually didn't allow into the light. She held a small paper bag in her hands, gripping it as if unsure whether she should offer it or keep it to herself. "Mr. Marshall," she said softly. Evan studied her expression. "Helen." She hesitated before speaking, the words gathering in the space between them. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I didn't want my apology last night to be the end of my responsibility." Evan didn't step aside yet. He waited, not unkindly, just honestly, giving her space to find her truth. Helen lifted the bag slightly, though her voice trembled. "This isn't much, just something I baked. My grandmother used to make it for me whenever she'd say, 'We can't change the past, but we can honor it by being better.' I thought, maybe it was the right thing to bring." Evan didn't take the bag immediately. He could see the effort behind the gesture, the vulnerability, the fear of being dismissed, and the deeper fear of leaving wrongdoing unaddressed. He finally stepped aside. "Come in." Relief washed over her face as she entered, though her steps were cautious, as if she feared she didn't belong in the calm that filled the home. She stood near the living room, glancing at the notebook on the table. "I won't stay long. I just didn't want last night to end with me walking away and thinking that words were enough." Evan gestured for her to sit, and she lowered herself onto the couch, the bag resting in her lap. She clasped her hands, voice unsteady. "I saw the footage this morning. I saw myself, and it was awful. Not what happened to me, what I allowed to happen to you. I thought I deserved special treatment because I paid more, or because I was used to things going my way." Her eyes glistened with shame she couldn't hide. "I was wrong, and I needed to come here to tell you that again." Evan sat across from her. His voice was calm, steady. "Helen, acknowledgement is not weakness. It's courage." She shook her head. "I don't feel courageous. I feel accountable." "That's the beginning," he said gently. She breathed out slowly, her shoulders relaxing a fraction. "I heard about the reporters, about the airline, about the country paying attention. I know I contributed to all of this. And I want you to know, if you speak publicly, and if they ask about me, you don't owe me softness. Tell the truth." Evan considered her words, her sincerity, her desire to be part of the reckoning rather than hide from it. "I will tell the truth," he said, "not to hurt you, but because that's what's needed." Helen nodded, accepting the truth as something necessary, not punitive. She stood, smoothing her jacket. "I'll leave you to prepare for everything ahead. But before I do, thank you for your patience, for not returning cruelty with cruelty, for giving me a chance to see myself clearly." He gave a small nod. "Take care, Helen." She placed the bag of baked goods gently on the table, then walked to the door with quiet steps. When she stepped outside, she paused on the porch, straightened her posture, and faced the reporters who were still unaware of her presence. For a moment, Evan watched her through the window. She squared her shoulders and then walked away, not sneaking, not hiding, choosing instead to face whatever the world might ask of her. He turned from the window, letting out a long breath. His phone buzzed again. A message from Dana. "Meeting confirmed. We're ready when you are." Evan picked up his notebook, his keys, and his jacket. Standing in the living room, he let the morning light fall across him. He said softly to himself, "Today is about truth." Then he walked toward the door, opened it slowly, and stepped into the sunlight. Dozens of microphones lifted, camera shutters fluttered like wings. Voices called his name. But Evan walked forward calmly, dignity steady in every breath he took. He wasn't stepping into chaos. He was stepping into purpose. And the nation waiting outside was about to hear the truth from the man who had lived it. The walkway leading from Evan's front door to the sidewalk felt longer than it ever had, though he moved with steady purpose. Each step carried a subtle weight, not of fear, but of clarity. The morning light warmed his shoulders as he approached the cluster of reporters gathered at the edge of his lawn. Their voices rose in waves, a symphony of questions layered on top of one another. Yet, as Evan stepped forward, the noise softened, settling into a hush. Some part of the crowd sensed he would speak only when he chose to, and not a moment sooner. He stopped a few feet from the microphones, cameras fixated on him, lenses glinting like dozens of unblinking eyes. He inhaled slowly, letting the breath settle deep inside him. Then he began, "Good morning." The simple greeting steadied the space, drawing every ear closer. "I know many of you have questions about what happened last night," he said, "and I want to speak directly to them, not to fuel anger, but to tell the truth." The wind shifted lightly, carrying his words across the crowd. "I was removed from a flight after refusing to give up the seat I purchased. I was calm, I was respectful, I followed every instruction, and still, I was treated as though my presence in that seat needed justification." A ripple passed through the reporters, the kind that signaled a collective recognition. Evan continued, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about dignity. It's about whether every person is shown the same respect, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, no matter their place in life." He paused, letting the silence breathe before filling it again. "But I want to be clear. I'm not here to tear down anyone. I'm not here to seek revenge. I'm here because change cannot happen from silence." His gaze swept slowly across the crowd, meeting eyes without flinching. There were people on that flight who stood for what was right, a young attendant who chose truth over fear, passengers who stepped forward with honesty, even someone who made mistakes but found the courage to confront them. I want the world to remember them too. A few reporters lowered their cameras slightly, surprised by the depth of his acknowledgement. "What happened last night isn't just an incident to be reviewed," he said softly. "It is an opportunity for the airline, for every industry that serves people, and for all of us." He placed one hand lightly on his chest. "My hope is not to create division. My hope is to inspire better." The words settled gently into the morning air. When he finished, the crowd remained silent for several seconds, absorbing the fullness of what he said. Then questions rose again, calmer now, more purposeful. "Mr. Marshall," one reporter asked, "will you be pressing charges?" "No," Evan replied. "I'm not seeking punishment. I'm seeking progress." Another voice called out, Will you work with the airline moving forward? I've agreed to help build a deeper understanding of dignity within their training and leadership, he said. Accountability is important, but transformation requires partnership. A third reporter leaned forward. What gives you hope that change is possible? Evan took a gentle breath. Because I saw it last night, in ordinary people, in unexpected moments, in apologies offered without being demanded, and in the courage of those who refuse to let silence be the final story. His voice softened further. Hope doesn't come from perfection. It comes from reflection. The questions continued for several minutes, but each answer Evan gave remained rooted in truth, compassion, and unwavering clarity. He spoke of systems, not individuals, of culture, not blame, of possibility, not bitterness. When the press finally stepped back, sensing he had said all he intended to say, Evan offered a small nod. Thank you for listening. He turned and walked toward his car, ignoring the lingering shouts that followed. He had spoken what needed to be spoken. The rest would unfold in its time. As he drove toward the corporate headquarters for the scheduled meeting, the city around him pulsed with a mixture of routine and expectancy. Cars moved along busy streets. People walked to work, carrying coffee cups and shoulder bags. Life continued, unaware that something quiet and powerful was happening in the heart of the industry. When he arrived, Dana met him at the entrance. She wore a look that blended relief and respect. "They're waiting for you upstairs," she said. He nodded. "Let's go." They walked through polished hallways and into a large conference room where Marion Hale, several executives, legal counsel, training directors, and employee representatives sat around a long table. As Evan entered, conversations halted. Marion stood. "Mr. Marshall," she said, "thank you for coming." He took his seat. "Let's begin." What followed was hours of intensive discussion. Evan recounted every detail with precision, his voice steady and composed. The advisors reviewed policies. Legal counsel acknowledged gaps. Training directors looked shaken by the implications of what had happened. Employee representatives, some teary, expressed their desire for a workplace that honored the humanity of everyone it served. Marion listened closely through every moment, hands folded, face somber but resolute. When Evan finished, she leaned forward. "This will not be forgotten," she said, nor minimized. She outlined the concrete steps the airline would take: immediate retraining, culture-wide evaluations, accountability across leadership levels, public commitments, and a new advisory role for Evan to help shape long-term reform. As she spoke, Evan watched the room shift, not with fear, but with earnest responsibility. When the meeting ended, Marion pulled him aside. "Your voice changed the direction of this company today." Evan responded softly. "It wasn't just my voice. It was everyone who chose truth." She nodded, deeply moved. "Even so, you set the tone." He gave a faint smile. "I set the truth. The tone is yours to carry, later." As Evan walked out of the building, he felt the sunlight touch him again. Warmer now, brighter. He exhaled, releasing the tension he had held since the night before. His phone vibrated. A message from his mother. "Proud of you. Always." He closed his eyes briefly, letting those words anchor him. Another message appeared, from Lily. "They told us about the changes. Thank you for giving your strength to a place that needed it." Another message followed, from Daniel. "You spoke with more dignity than anyone I've ever seen. If you ever need support, I'm here." And finally, one more, from Helen. "I listened to your words today. They were exactly what the world needed. I'm still learning. Thank you for giving me a reason to try." Evan stood by his car, the warmth of the sun settling on his shoulders. He looked up at the sky, its blue expanse stretching far beyond the reach of any plane. What happened to him had been unjust, painful, familiar, but what grew from it carried further than the sky itself. It carried truth. It carried courage. It carried hope. He opened the car door, placed his notebook on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel. Before starting the engine, he whispered to the quiet interior, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The road ahead waited, not demanding, not threatening, simply open, and Evan drove forward, ready for whatever came next. The story is not just about a seat being taken away or a passenger being treated unfairly. It touches on something deeper, how we view human dignity, and our ability to stand up for what is right. Older people often understand best not every battle requires shouting. Sometimes calmness, composure, and dignity are the greatest strengths. Evan, the main character, does not retaliate, does not get angry, does not insult anyone. He chooses the much harder path: confront, tell the truth, and then let kindness guide the way. What we learn from this story is that when injustice happens, silence is not always the answer. But speaking up does not mean hurting others. We can maintain our dignity and humanity. We can demand justice without losing our kindness. And most importantly, every small action today can change a system tomorrow. Hopefully, the story helps you remember one simple thing. Human dignity cannot be taken away by anyone unless we let it go. Thank you for taking the time to follow this emotional story. If you find the story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can bring more humane content. Your companionship is the greatest motivation for us to continue telling stories of healing and hope.